Santelli, and especially to my colleague Bill for letting me be a part of this. It's a real honor to be here, and I don't know if I'm back and clean up or what, but thanks. So, not long after Woody Guthrie arrives in LA in 1937, he did a very LA thing. He took a trip to Tijuana, Mexico. There he is. Fresh off his radio successes at KFVD with the Woody and Lefty Lou show, Guthrie got an offer to do a show on radio XELO, one of the many border blaster radio stations that transmitted from just south of the US-Mexico border to avoid FCC restrictions. Like all the so-called X stations, XELO helped define the sound and style of American wireless pop culture, from the Carter Family to Wolfman Jack, and did so from beyond US borders. The most American of sounds, direct from northern Mexico. Woody Guthrie and his family settled into a motel in Chula Vista on the US side of the borderline, and for the next 3 weeks would cross the border to Tijuana to do their show on XELO. Now, Woody's Tijuana trip, some of you might know, ended like so many Tijuana tourist trips did in those days, with bouts of heavy drinking and a visit from the Mexican cops, who eventually ended Woody Guthrie's south of the border stay, not by putting him in the Tijuana jail that the Kingston Trio would sing about 20 years later, but by deporting Woody back north. Now I start with this seeming footnote to Guthrie's California story to wonder aloud if Woody's Tijuana broadcasts, none of which, to my knowledge, remain, were the secret apolitical beginning of his politicized migrant aesthetics, what Guthrie famously called the art and science of migrating. The first time, was it in fact the first time, that Woody wasn't singing about borders, but straddling them, immersing his songs and stories in a cross-border cultural economy of radio, tourism, and entertainment, and a cross-border political economy of immigration, empire, and inspection that would, from 1938 on, become associated with his songbook and his legacy, even if he rarely actually returned there, even if the border and Mexican migrancy would become stronger in Woody's afterlife than they ever were when he was alive. Now, the principal connection, between Woody Guthrie and Mexican migrants, of course, comes not from his own cross-border trips, but from the fatal trip of January 28, 1948, when a plane went down over Los Gatos Canyon, killing the 36 people on board. 32 of those 36 people were farm workers who had been brought north to work in the fields of the United States under the U.S. Bracero program. And as part of the program's mandate, the U.S. labor contractors would not only fly migrants in, but when their work was no longer needed, they would have to be flown back to the U.S.-Mexico border. Not back home, but back to the border. When Guthrie read newspaper accounts of the plane crash, he was outraged that only 4 names were published in the articles, those of the non-Mexican plane staff and crew. The rest were listed solely as quote-unquote Mexican deportees. The incident inspired his lyrics, which went far beyond a protest of making Mexican labor faceless and Mexican death inconsequential, and by narrating them from the point of view of a Mexican farm worker. They became instead an indictment of the hypocrisies of U.S. immigration policy, and by extension, the anti-Mexican racism that was buried in the heart of the U.S. agribusiness we've just been hearing about. 600 miles to that Mexican border, he wrote, they chase us like outlaws, like rustlers, like thieves, taking on the voice of a Mexican migrant. We, Guthrie wrote, died in your hills. We died in your deserts. We died in your valleys and died on your plains. We died beneath your trees and we died in your bushes, both sides of the river. We died just the same. Woody Guthrie gave the Mexican dead on that plane names. Juan and Rosalita. And he reminded his listeners that the lifeblood of American nourishment pulses from Mexican corpses, scattered in the valleys, canyons, and fields of the Southwest. But it also pointed beyond the farming industry. By 1948, the focus on Dust Bowl migrants, he implied, had to shift toward Mexico. The Dust Bowl had become the border, and Mexican migrants, deportees and immigrants alike, were the new Tom Joads. No wonder then that the song has had a fierce return whenever anti-Mexican immigrant policy has reared its head, showing up in the repertoires, for example, of contemporary bands like Los Super 7 and two LA bands, Quetzal and Los Illegals, collaborating with classic LA punk band like Los Illegals, Concrete Blonde. And the song Deportee has made a strong return, as you might imagine, in the past year, where the graveyard of Los Gatos Canyon has become the desert graveyards of Arizona and Sonora, and the political battleground over immigration policy has shifted to its current Arizona epicenter. The band Outer National, for example, who have just made their version of Woody Guthrie's song a centerpiece of their new album, which they've called Todos Somos Ilegales, We Are All Illegals. A song that they play on their current US-Mexico border tour, playing at sites along the US-Mexico border as we speak, ending in Los Angeles in a couple weeks. And a song that they then turned into a video with an immigrant rights activist group designed to call attention to immigrant rights. I'm going to play just a little bit of Outer National's take on Woody Guthrie.
The crops are rolling and the peaches are rotting, the oranges are piling, and Clio's so dumb, they're flying you back to the Mexican border to pay all your money and wait back again. Goodbye to my wild, goodbye to Rosalita, adios a mis amigos, en su Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplanes, all they will call you will be
Now, what we might call the Mexicanization of Woody Guthrie's migrant politics, of course, is most directly articulated in the evolution of the Tom Joad figure himself, an articulation most extensively put forth by someone we just heard a little bit about, Bruce Springsteen, on his 1995 album, The Ghost of Tom Joad. Now, with his Dust Bowl migrant classic, The Ballad of Tom Joad, that we've been hearing about, Woody Guthrie had given birth to this new pop music archetype, a sullen icon of dispossession and drift, who still returns to us in new guises with new stories whenever anybody is forced to hit the road, forced to sweat in the sun for less than a living wage, and become, in his words, as we've heard, busted, disgusted, down and out and looking for work. By the time Tom Joad landed in Springsteen's hands, Woody Guthrie's icon of the rugged white southern migrant blown west by dust and drought had become quite a different ghost among a very different set of the living. A family sleeping in their car, a man whose home is a cardboard box beneath a freeway underpass. Rock critic Dave Marsh once described Woody Guthrie's Joads as, quote, doomed figures of courageous sentiment. Springsteen's Joads, whether they turn out to be Mexican immigrants, ex-Marine INS agents, Vietnam vets, or the Vietnamese refugees they want to murder, all have some kind of hole in their belly and some kind of gun in their hand. The quiet, sour determination and anger of Henry Fonda's celluloid Joad, who never actually, in a way, gives up, I think, on the optimism of California, haunts Springsteen's New World Order migrants, precisely because it's not who they are. Springsteen's Joads have barely made it to California, and they've already been expelled from the garden, and they've left homeless or drug addicted or dead or worse. They fall in love with things that will only hurt them. The highway is alive tonight, Springsteen sings, but nobody's kidding nobody about where it goes. Though the highways of Springsteen's Joads run in various directions, the direction they most frequently run is south-north, from the Mexican border on up. Highways covered, as they are now, in migrant shadows. A Mexican-born INS agent who drinks at a bar in Tijuana tells his partner in one of Springsteen's songs, quote, they risk death in the deserts and mountains, pay all they got to the smugglers' rings, we send them home, and they come right back again, Carl. Hunger is a powerful thing.